It was a bitterly cold December evening, the kind that left the air sharp and unforgiving. Inside the town hospital, a steady stream of visitors moved through the brightly lit halls. Doctors hurried from room to room, nurses wheeled patients to various units, and visitors shuffled in and out, clutching coats tightly against the winter chill. Outside, under the glow of the hospital's entrance lights, life moved at a slower, quieter pace. Every evening, as the sun set and the chill deepened, a small puppy took up his spot near the hospital's revolving doors. His presence had become a familiar sight to the hospital staff, who began to refer to him simply as the Little Watcher. His fur was a patchwork of tan and white, dirted and matted from weeks of living outdoors. His body was thin, his ribs faintly visible, yet his posture was resolute. He waited there nightly, undeterred by the biting cold or the chaos of human activity around him. No one knew where he came from or why he stayed. Some assumed he was a stray, while others speculated he was waiting for someone inside. The dog never begged for food or attention. Instead, he sat with his head resting on his paws, his deep brown eyes fixed on the revolving doors as though expecting someone to walk through them at any moment. Dr. Thomas Walker first noticed the puppy on one such frosty evening. He was a senior pediatrician at the hospital, well known for his dedication and focus. At 45, Thomas was a man of habit and discipline, often consumed by the demands of his profession. His days were spent diagnosing illnesses, comforting worried parents, and attending endless meetings. He rarely had time for distractions. That night, as he walked out of the hospital, pulling his coat tight against the freezing wind, his eyes landed on the puppy. The sight made him pause. The small dog was curled up tightly against the side of the building, shivering visibly, but still staring at the doors. "Strange," Thomas murmured, adjusting his scarf. He took a step closer, his shoes crunching softly against the salted pavement. The puppy didn't flinch or react to his approach. Instead, he briefly lifted his head, his ears twitching slightly before resting back on his paws. "What's he doing here?" Thomas asked aloud, though there was no one around to answer him. A passing nurse, who had just finished her shift, overheard him and stopped. "Oh, you noticed him," she said, her breath fogging in the cold air. "He's been here for weeks." "For weeks?" Thomas frowned. "And no one's done anything about him?" The nurse shrugged, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. "A few of us leave him scraps sometimes, but he won't come close. He just sits there like he's waiting for someone. It's sad, really." Thomas's gaze lingered on the puppy. The little dog's eyes seemed impossibly sad, almost human in their depth. He shook his head and turned away, muttering something about how someone should call animal control. The next night, as Thomas walked out of the hospital after another exhausting shift, the puppy was there again, in the same spot. Snow was falling steadily now, and a thin layer had settled over the dog's fur. He didn't seem to notice or care. His focus remained on the revolving doors. This time, Thomas hesitated. He couldn't explain why, but something about the dog tugged at his heart. He crouched down a few feet away, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "You're still here, huh?" he said softly, his breath visible in the cold air. The puppy's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he didn't move closer. His eyes flicked to Thomas for a brief moment before returning to the hospital doors. "Who are you waiting for?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, the dog didn't answer, but there was something in his posture, in the quiet determination of his gaze, that made Thomas feel a pang of sadness. The next morning, as Thomas sipped his coffee in the hospital break room, he brought up the dog in a casual conversation with Sarah, a nurse he had worked with for years. "That little dog's still out there," he said, setting his cup down. "What's the story with him?" Sarah shook her head, her expression softening. "No one really knows. Some of the staff think he belonged to a patient who might have passed away. He started showing up around the same time an elderly man was admitted to the ICU a few weeks ago." Thomas frowned. "And no one's looked into it?" "What will we even look into?" Sarah replied. "He's just a dog. Maybe he's waiting for someone who's never coming back." Her words stayed with Thomas throughout the day. That evening, when he left the hospital, he stopped by the dog's spot again. This time, He brought a small blanket he had taken from the supply closet. "Here," he said, draping the blanket gently over the dog. "It's freezing out here." The puppy didn't resist. He didn't move at all, except to lift his head slightly and glance at Thomas with those same sorrowful eyes. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself thinking about the dog more and more. He started lingering by the hospital entrance each evening, watching as the puppy sat patiently, his vigil unbroken. Some nights, Thomas brought scraps of food or fresh water, which the dog accepted cautiously once Thomas had walked away. It wasn't like him to fixate on something so small, so seemingly inconsequential. But there was something about the dog that he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the animal's resilience in the face of the bitter cold. It was the unanswered question of why. Who was this dog waiting for? And why wouldn't he leave? One evening, as Thomas sat in his car, the question gnawed at him until he couldn't ignore it any longer. He decided to ask the hospital receptionist if anyone had reported a missing dog. "Not that I know of," she replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she checked the system. "Why?" "There's a dog that's been sitting outside the hospital for weeks," Thomas explained. "I thought maybe he belonged to one of the patients." The receptionist shook her head. "I haven't heard anything about a dog. Maybe he's just a stray." Thomas wasn't satisfied with the answer. That night, as he sat beside the dog on the cold steps, he spoke to him again, his voice low and thoughtful. "Who are you waiting for?" he asked. "Someone inside? Or someone who's never coming back?" The puppy's only response was to rest his head on his paws and let out a soft sigh. Thomas couldn't shake the dog's haunting loyalty. Over the following nights, he developed a quiet routine. After finishing his shifts, he would check on the little dog, bringing scraps of food, fresh water, and occasionally speaking softly to him. While the dog didn't follow or fully trust him, he allowed Thomas's presence nearby, a subtle but growing bond. One particularly cold night, Thomas lingered longer than usual. The dog's quiet resolve had become a strange comfort to him, an anchor amid his chaotic days. As he sat on the steps of the hospital, watching his breath mingle with the icy air, an elderly janitor walked by, pushing a mop bucket. "You still talking to that little dog, Doc?" the janitor asked, his tone warm but teasing. Thomas glanced up. "Do you know anything about him?" The janitor stopped and leaned on his mop handle. "Not much. He's been here for weeks now. Some folks think he's waiting for someone. Someone inside?" Thomas asked, though the thought had already crossed his mind. The janitor shrugged. "Could be. There was an old man admitted around the time that dog first showed up. Name was Edward Langley. Poor guy didn't make it. Passed away after a heart attack. Lived alone, no family listed." Thomas's chest tightened. "You think this dog belonged to him?" "Who's to say? Dogs like that, they're loyal. He might be waiting for someone who ain't coming back." The janitor's words stayed with Thomas long after he drove home that night. If the dog was Edward Langley's, what did that mean for him now? He had no one else. Was he just waiting for someone who would never walk through those hospital doors again? The next day, Thomas couldn't focus. Between his patient rounds and meetings, his thoughts kept drifting back to the dog and to Edward Langley. Who was he? Did he really live alone, as the janitor said? And if so, what kind of bond had he shared with the little dog waiting outside the hospital? During his lunch break, Thomas asked the receptionist if he could look through the hospital's recent records. Though it was unusual for a doctor to sift through files that didn't pertain to their field, his reputation for being thorough left few questioning him. He found Edward Langley's file quickly. The notes confirmed what the janitor had said. He had been admitted 3 weeks earlier after collapsing at home. His neighbors had called for help when they hadn't seen him for days. He had no listed next of kin and no emergency contacts. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the file. A wave of sadness swept over him. Edward Langley had died alone, without anyone by his side. But then Thomas noticed something else. Among the scant personal belongings listed in Edward's inventory was a leash. It was the only item mentioned. Thomas's heart sank. He closed the file and resolved to dig deeper. That evening, Thomas drove to Edward Langley's house. It was a modest single-story home at the edge of town, its peeling paint and overgrown garden giving it an air of quiet neglect. As he pulled into the driveway, he wondered what he hoped to find. Closure? Answers? Or maybe just proof that the dog's loyalty wasn't in vain. A neighbor watering her plants in the adjacent yard noticed him and approached, her expression curious but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked, her breath visible in the chilly air. Thomas introduced himself, explaining that he worked at the hospital where Edward Langley had been treated. "I've been trying to piece together his story," he said. "There's a dog, his dog, I think, waiting outside the hospital. I want to know more about him." The woman's face softened. "Oh, that must be Max," she said. "Edward loved that little dog. They were inseparable. Wherever Edward went, Max followed. He was all Edward had." Thomas nodded, his chest tightening. "Do you know what happened to Max after Edward passed?" The neighbor sighed, setting down her watering can. "When Edward was taken to the hospital, Max stayed behind. He sat on the porch for days, waiting. But when no one came back, he must have wandered off. I didn't realize he'd made it all the way to the hospital. He's been there for weeks," Thomas said, his voice low. "Just waiting." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "That poor dog. He doesn't know Edward's gone." That night, Thomas sat on the hospital steps beside Max. Snow fell softly around them, and the quiet of the evening was broken only by the distant hum of traffic. "I met your neighbor today," Thomas said, his voice soft. "She told me about Edward." Max's ears twitched at the sound of Edward's name. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Thomas's. For the first time, Thomas thought he saw a glimmer of recognition. "You've been waiting for him, haven't you?" Thomas continued. "You loved him." The puppy let out a soft whine, lowering his head back to his paws. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Max's back. The dog didn't pull away. "I can't bring him back," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can make sure you're not alone anymore." It wasn't a decision Thomas had planned to make, but in that moment it felt right. He couldn't leave Max out in the cold any longer. He scooped the dog into his arms, feeling how light and fragile he was. Max didn't resist. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to be carried away from the hospital steps. Thomas carried Max into his home for the first time that night. The house, usually quiet and sterile, seemed to hum with new energy as the little dog tentatively explored his surroundings. Max moved cautiously, sniffing each corner as though unsure whether this new place could be trusted. His movements were slow, his thin frame trembling slightly with every step. "You don't have to worry," Thomas said gently, crouching to Max's level. "This is your home now." Max's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he didn't look up. Thomas sighed and walked to the kitchen, rummaging through his cabinets for something suitable for a dog. He eventually settled on some leftover chicken and rice, warming it slightly before placing it in a shallow dish on the floor. "Here," he said, setting the food down a few feet away from Max. The dog hesitated, his dark eyes watching Thomas warily. Slowly, cautiously, he crept forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the food. Then, as though deciding it was safe, he began to eat. Thomas watched in silence, his heart aching at how starved Max seemed. Each bite was careful but desperate, as though he feared it might be taken away at any moment. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Thomas murmured. "But you're safe now. I promise." After Max finished eating, he retreated to a corner of the living room, curling up on the rug. Thomas brought over the blanket he had draped over Max at the hospital, spreading it over him like a makeshift bed. Max gave a small sigh, his body relaxing slightly for the first time that night. As Thomas sat on the couch, watching the little dog drift off to sleep, he felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It was strange. He had spent his entire career caring for others, yet this simple act of helping Max felt profoundly different. It wasn't just about providing care. It was about connection. The next morning, Thomas woke to the sound of soft scratching. He opened his eyes to find Max standing by the front door, his tail wagging faintly. "You want to go out?" Thomas asked, his voice groggy. He got up, grabbed his coat, and opened the door. Max trotted out into the yard, sniffing the frosty grass before circling and finding a spot to sit. Thomas watched him from the doorway, his thoughts returning to Edward Langley. There were still so many unanswered questions. Why had Edward lived alone? What had his life been like before the hospital? And most importantly, What could Thomas do to honor the bond Edward and Max had shared? Later that day, Thomas decided to return to Edward's house. He knocked on the neighbor's door again, hoping she might have more insight into Edward's life. The woman, who introduced herself as Clara, invited him inside. Her home was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of freshly baked cookies. She poured Thomas a cup of tea and began to talk about Edward. He was a quiet man, she said, stirring her own cup, kept to himself mostly, but he was kind. Always had a smile and a wave for everyone on the street. Do you know how he came to have Max? Thomas asked. Clara smiled. Oh, that little dog was a stray when Edward found him. It was a few years ago, one of the coldest winters we've had. Max was just a puppy, abandoned in the park. Edward took him in, and from that day on, they were inseparable. You'd never see one without the other. Thomas nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He could picture it. Edward walking down the street, Max trotting happily by his side. It made the dog's vigil outside the hospital even more heartbreaking. Edward didn't have family? Thomas asked. Clara shook her head. Not that I know of. He mentioned a sister once, but they hadn't spoken in years. He never said why. Thomas left Clara's house with a heavy heart, but a clearer picture of Edward's life. Max wasn't just a pet to Edward. He was family. And now, Thomas felt the weight of that responsibility. As the days passed, Max began to settle into his new life with Thomas. The once wary dog grew more comfortable, following Thomas from room to room and even wagging his tail when Thomas returned home from work. It was a slow transformation, but each small step felt like a victory. Meanwhile, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more for Edward. One evening, as he sat with Max by the fireplace, he pulled out Edward's hospital file again. Along with the notes and medical records was a list of personal belongings that had been retrieved from Edward's home. One item stood out, a journal. The next day, Thomas drove to the hospital storage facility and retrieved the journal. It was old and worn, its pages filled with Edward's neat handwriting. As Thomas flipped through it, he was struck by the depth of Edward's thoughts. The entries were a mix of reflections, observations, and memories. Many of them mentioned Max. Max saved me, one entry read. I found him on a day when I thought I had nothing left to live for. But he gave me a reason to keep going. He reminded me that there's still love in the world, even when it feels like everything else has fallen apart. Thomas closed the journal, tears stinging his eyes. Edward had loved Max deeply, and now that love had passed to him. He resolved to honor Edward's memory by doing something meaningful. Thomas shared Edward's story with Sarah and a few close colleagues at the hospital. They were moved by the tale of the loyal dog and the man who had saved him. Together, they came up with an idea, a memorial fund in Edward's name, dedicated to helping stray animals like Max. The hospital staff rallied behind the idea. They organized a fundraiser, sharing Max's story with the community. Donations poured in, and soon, they had enough to launch the Edward Langley Animal Assistance Fund. Max became the face of the campaign. His story of loyalty and resilience inspired people far and wide. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, strangers from across the country were sending messages of support. For Thomas, it was more than just a fundraiser. It was a way to keep Edward's spirit alive and to ensure that other animals would have a chance at the kind of love and care Edward had given Max. The Edward Langley Animal Assistance Fund began as a local initiative, but its impact quickly outgrew the small town. The fundraiser gained national attention after a heartfelt news segment aired, showcasing Max's story. Donations flooded in from across the country, along with letters from people who had been touched by the story of Max's unwavering loyalty and Edward's selfless love. For Thomas, the outpouring of support was both inspiring and humbling. He had started this journey with no intention other than to care for a grieving dog. Yet here he was, spearheading a movement that had the potential to save countless lives. One evening, Sarah approached him with an idea. What if we used the fund to start a mobile veterinary clinic? She suggested. There are so many animals out there like Max who don't have access to care. We could bring help to them. Thomas considered it. The hospital had provided him with a sense of purpose for years, but this idea felt different. It wasn't just about treating symptoms. It was about creating a lasting impact. "I like it," he said finally. "Let's do it." The team began planning in earnest. They partnered with local veterinarians, animal shelters, and even a few corporate sponsors who donated supplies. The mobile clinic would be named Max's Mission, a tribute to the dog whose loyalty had inspired it all. Launching the mobile clinic wasn't without its challenges. Securing permits, coordinating schedules, and outfitting the vehicle with the necessary equipment took months. Thomas juggled his hospital duties with the growing demands of the project, often working late into the night to ensure everything was on track. Max, ever the loyal companion, stayed by his side through it all. The little dog had blossomed in the months since Thomas had taken him in. His fur was now clean and shiny, his body healthy and strong. But what struck Thomas most was the light in Max's eyes. The sadness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by trust and a quiet joy. The first day of Max's mission was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. The clinic set up in a low-income neighborhood where access to veterinary care was scarce. A line of people with their pets formed almost immediately, stretching down the block. Thomas and the team worked tirelessly, treating everything from minor injuries to chronic conditions. By the end of the day, they had helped over 50 animals. It was exhausting work, but as Thomas looked at Max, who sat patiently by his side, he knew it was worth it. Despite the overwhelming success of the mobile clinic, not everyone supported the initiative. Some local veterinarians viewed it as competition, fearing it would hurt their businesses. Others criticized the project as unsustainable, claiming it was just a feel-good story that wouldn't last. Thomas felt the weight of the criticism, but he refused to let it deter him. He knew what they were doing mattered. For every person who doubted them, there were dozens more who sent messages of gratitude and encouragement. One particularly harsh critic was Gerald Parker, the owner of a large veterinary chain in the region. He accused the clinic of undercutting local practices and even filed a formal complaint with the town council, claiming Max's Mission was operating without proper oversight. The complaint led to a hearing, where Thomas was forced to defend the project in front of a panel of officials. He brought Max with him, and as he spoke about the clinic's impact and the inspiration behind it, the little dog sat quietly at his feet, a living testament to the power of compassion. By the end of the hearing, not only was the complaint dismissed, but several council members pledged their support for the initiative. With the legal challenges behind them, Max's Mission expanded its reach. The team began traveling to rural areas where veterinary care was often hours away. They worked with local shelters to provide free spay and neuter clinics, vaccinated hundreds of animals, and even facilitated adoptions. Max, who had initially been shy around strangers, became the clinic's unofficial mascot. His calm demeanor and gentle nature put nervous animals at ease, and his story continued to inspire everyone who met him. One day, while packing up after a clinic event, a young girl approached Thomas. She was holding a small kitten with a broken leg, her eyes wide with worry. "Can you help her?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Thomas knelt down, gently taking the kitten from her. "We'll do everything we can," he promised. The kitten, whom the girl had named Daisy, required surgery and weeks of recovery. The team rallied together to provide her care, and when she was finally ready to go home, the young girl was waiting with tears of gratitude in her eyes. Moments like these reminded Thomas why he had started this journey. It wasn't just about the animals. It was about the people who loved them and the connections they shared. As Max's Mission continued to grow, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, there was one part of Edward's story that still weighed on him. Edward's estranged sister. Clara, Edward's neighbor, had mentioned her in passing, but Thomas hadn't pursued it. One evening, as he flipped through Edward's journal, he found an entry that mentioned her by name, Margaret. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me, but I hope she knows I've always loved her." Thomas decided to track her down. It took weeks of searching, but he finally found Margaret living in a nearby town. When he knocked on her door and explained who he was, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd never hear about Edward again," she said, inviting him inside. Thomas shared Edward's story and told her about Max. Margaret listened intently, her emotions shifting between sadness and warmth. "I wish I'd reached out sooner," she said, her voice breaking. But it's comforting to know he wasn't alone in the end, and that Max had him. Margaret became an unexpected ally in Max's mission. She donated a portion of Edward's estate to the fund and even volunteered at a few events. Her involvement felt like a final piece falling into place, a way to honor her brother's memory and heal old wounds. The clinic flourished in the years that followed, its impact stretching far beyond what Thomas had ever imagined. Edward's name became synonymous with compassion and second chances, and Max's story was told and retold as a symbol of unwavering loyalty. One quiet evening, as Thomas sat on the porch with Max curled up beside him, he looked out at the shelter they had built together, a place where animals and people found hope and healing. "We did it, buddy," he said, stroking Max's fur. "Edward's dream lives on." Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting Thomas's. In that moment, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. Together, they had turned a story of loss into one of love, resilience, and purpose. The shelter and mobile clinic had become cornerstones of the community, but Thomas knew there was more to be done. The demand for their services continued to grow, and requests began pouring in from neighboring towns and cities. People wanted Max's mission to visit their communities, to bring care to animals that had no other options. One evening, as Thomas reviewed the clinic schedule, Sarah walked into his office. She carried a folder filled with proposals and reports, her expression both excited and serious. "We've outgrown our current resources," she said, setting the folder on the desk. "If we want to keep up with demand, we need to expand." Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering her words. Expansion meant more funding, more staff, and a greater commitment of time and energy. It was daunting, but the thought of turning anyone away felt worse. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Sarah flipped open the folder. "We could add another mobile unit, maybe even two. There's also a property for sale just outside town, a perfect location for a permanent shelter and clinic." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A second shelter? Why not?" Sarah replied. "Edward's legacy isn't just about what we've done here. It's about how far we can take this." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked down at Max, who was lying at his feet, his tail wagging faintly as if in approval. "Let's do it," he said. The months that followed were some of the busiest of Thomas's life. With Sarah leading the charge, the team launched a new fundraising campaign to support the expansion. They shared stories of the animals they had saved and the people they had helped, and the response was overwhelming. Donations came in from all over the country, many accompanied by heartfelt messages. Some donors had been inspired by Max's story. Others shared their own experiences of love and loyalty with their pets. Construction on the new shelter began in the spring. It was a sprawling property with plenty of room for both animals and staff. The design included a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, spacious kennels, and even a training center for volunteers. Max became a regular presence at the construction site, trotting alongside workers and overseeing their progress as if he understood the importance of their work. His gentle demeanor and quiet confidence endeared him to everyone he met. By the time the shelter was complete, it was more than just a facility. It was a symbol of what love and determination could achieve. As the years went by, Max grew older. His once boundless energy began to wane, and his fur turned gray around the muzzle. But his spirit remained as strong as ever. He continued to accompany Thomas to the clinic and shelter, greeting visitors with his wagging tail and calming nervous animals with his presence. One afternoon, as Thomas sat with Max in the shelter's garden, a young boy approached them. He was clutching a small dog wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide with worry. "Is he going to be okay?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Thomas crouched down to examine the dog, a scrappy little terrier with a badly injured paw. "We'll take good care of him," he promised. The boy nodded, his expression softening. He reached out to pet Max, who licked his hand gently. "That's Max," Thomas said with a smile. "He's our hero around here." The boy looked up at Thomas, his eyes full of admiration. "I think he's the best dog ever." Thomas's chest tightened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He really is." Max's health began to decline as he entered his twilight years. Thomas knew the day would come when he'd have to say goodbye, but he wasn't ready. How could he ever be ready to lose the dog who had changed his life? One crisp autumn morning, as the sun rose over the shelter, Max passed away peacefully in his sleep. Thomas was by his side, his hand resting gently on Max's fur as tears streamed down his face. The news spread quickly, and the outpouring of love and support was overwhelming. People from all over the world sent messages of condolence, sharing stories of how Max had inspired them. The team held a memorial service for Max at the shelter. Hundreds of people attended, bringing flowers, letters, and photos of their own pets. It was a celebration of Max's life and the incredible legacy he had left behind. Thomas stood before the crowd, holding Edward's journal in his hands. Max wasn't just a dog, he said, his voice trembling. He was a symbol of love, loyalty, and resilience. He taught us what it means to care, to hope, and to believe in second chances. And though he's no longer with us, his spirit will always guide us. In the years that followed, the shelter and clinic continued to grow. They added more mobile units, expanded to new locations, and developed programs to educate communities about animal welfare. Max's story remained at the heart of their mission, a reminder of why they did what they did. Thomas, now in his 60s, still worked tirelessly to honor Edward and Max's legacy. He often thought about that cold winter night when he first saw Max sitting outside the hospital. He had no idea then how much that little dog would change his life. One evening, as Thomas sat on the porch of the shelter, watching the sun set over the fields, he felt a familiar warmth beside him. He looked down to see a young dog, a rescue from their latest clinic, curled up at his feet. The dog's eyes, filled with trust and love, reminded him of Max. Thomas smiled. "You've got some big paws to fill," he said softly. "But I think you're up to the task." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and often difficult, but it had been worth it. Edward's dream, Max's loyalty, and the countless lives they had touched would live on. The young rescue dog, whom Thomas eventually named Finn, quickly became a fixture at the shelter. Like Max before him, Finn had a quiet, calming presence that seemed to soothe the animals in his care. Thomas saw pieces of Max in Finn, not just in his demeanor, but in the bond they shared. Finn wasn't the only change in Thomas's life. The shelter, now one of the largest animal welfare organizations in the state, had become a beacon of hope for both people and animals. They had expanded their services to include rehabilitation for injured wildlife, therapy programs for veterans, and educational workshops for children. The next generation of leaders had begun to take shape as well. Sarah, who had been by Thomas's side since the beginning, took on a larger role in overseeing operations. A group of young veterinarians and animal behaviorists brought fresh ideas and energy to the team. One of these new leaders was Mia, a passionate young veterinarian who had been inspired by Max's story as a teenager. She approached Thomas one day with an ambitious proposal. "What if we created a nationwide network of shelters and clinics?" Mia suggested. "We could train other communities to replicate what we've done here." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "It's a big undertaking," he said, "but I like the way you think." With Mia leading the charge, the team began working on a pilot program. They partnered with smaller shelters across the country, sharing resources, training, and funding to help them grow. The initiative was named Max's Network, a tribute to the dog who had inspired it all. Thomas often thought about Edward Langley during quiet moments. The man who had saved Max, and who in turn had been saved by Max, remained a guiding force in everything Thomas did. On the anniversary of Edward's passing, Thomas and Sarah decided to revisit Edward's home. The house had remained untouched, its shutters faded, and its garden overgrown. They had left it that way intentionally, hoping to preserve Edward's memory. But now, they felt it was time to do something more. "What if we turned it into a sanctuary?" Sarah suggested as they stood outside the house. "A place where older animals, ones who might not get adopted, can live out their days in peace." Thomas's heart ached at the thought. "I think Edward would have liked that," he said. The project, dubbed Edward's Haven, became a passion project for the entire team. Volunteers worked tirelessly to restore the house and garden, transforming it into a serene and welcoming space. They added cozy rooms for the animals, walking paths through the gardens, and a memorial wall where people could honor their own pets. When Edward's Haven opened its doors, it quickly filled with senior animals, dogs, cats, and even a few rabbits, who had been overlooked by adopters. Finn became a frequent visitor, his youthful energy bringing life to the sanctuary. As Max's network grew, so did its impact. Communities across the country began adopting the model, creating their own shelters, mobile clinics, and outreach programs. The movement brought together people from all walks of life, united by a shared belief in compassion and second chances. The team hosted an annual conference to bring everyone together, sharing success stories and lessons learned. At one such event, Thomas was invited to give a keynote speech. Standing before a crowd of hundreds, he felt a wave of gratitude for how far they had come. "When I first met Max," he began, his voice steady but emotional. He was sitting outside the hospital, waiting for someone who would never come back. He didn't know it then, but his story was just beginning. "Max taught me that loyalty, love, and hope can change the world. And he proved that even the smallest among us can inspire something bigger than we ever imagined." The room erupted in applause, and Thomas felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just Edward's dream or Max's legacy anymore. It was a movement that belonged to everyone in the room. As the years went on, Thomas began to think about the future. He was in his 70s now, and while he still loved his work, he knew it was time to start stepping back. He had built something that would last far beyond his lifetime, and he wanted to ensure it was in good hands. He called a meeting with Sarah, Mia, and the rest of the leadership team. Together, they developed a plan for succession, ensuring that Max's mission and Edward's Haven would continue to thrive under new leadership. "I'm not going anywhere just yet," Thomas said with a smile. "But it's time for me to start passing the torch." Mia, who had proven herself as both a visionary leader and a compassionate caregiver, was chosen to take on the role of executive director. Sarah, who had been the heart of the organization from the beginning, decided to stay on as a mentor and advisor. On Thomas's last official day as director, the team organized a surprise celebration. Hundreds of people gathered at the shelter to honor his contributions, from longtime volunteers to families who had adopted pets through the program. As Thomas stood on the shelter's porch, looking out at the crowd, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Finn sat at his feet, wagging his tail as though he understood the significance of the moment. "I couldn't have done any of this alone," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is a testament to what we can achieve when we work together. Max may be gone, but his spirit is alive in every animal we save and every life we touch." Though Thomas had retired from his official duties, he remained a part of the Max's mission family. He spent his days volunteering at Edward's Haven, tending to the garden and spending time with the animals. Finn, now older and grayer, was always by his side. One evening, as Thomas sat in the garden, watching the sun set, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the day he first saw Max sitting outside the hospital to the sprawling network of shelters and clinics they had built, it had been an incredible adventure. "I hope we made you proud, Edward," he whispered, looking up at the stars. "Thank you for trusting me with Max." Finn rested his head on Thomas's lap, and Thomas smiled, stroking the dog's fur. The work would continue, carried forward by the next generation. And though Max and Edward were gone, their legacy would live on, inspiring kindness and compassion for years to come. As the stars twinkled above, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. The journey wasn't just about saving animals or building shelters. It was about love, loyalty, and the connections that make life worth living.